How's it going, everyone? Welcome again to another video on the React performance. And in today's video, we're gonna jump straight forward to the learn sections on the React docs, specifically managing the state as a way to now see how can we now set state updates in a maintainable way using Redusters. Okay, so we're gonna walk through this course as a way to describe here in my notes, because at the end of the day, the entire reason of actually recap this is just based on the React Performance course taught by Steve Keeney, head front-end engineer at Temporal, which is an open source tool for this is a durable execution platform. So you can think of this like a Kubernetes to cover a specific business use case. That's actually a very interesting tool. But the goal of this course is to see how can we now write React components in the most performant way possible. So because we're going to now jump in straight forward to what we really care about this, and for that is briefly describe the introduction, React rendering, redusting rendering, context, and suspense and transition, specifically this introduction, and then we jump into what we care about. So this is a course for anyone that wants to know how React works behind the scenes, and then how they can build a tool set that allow them to identify its React performance issues, and then come out with some best practice, some solutions to that. So, because after all, performance, the value proposition of this is better to not doing things right now rather than doing it. And the other is, there's some color that is to that. It is better to to do things later than do it now. So with this premise here, okay, as a way to when we need to load these React components, okay, hey, do we need to load that right now, or can we defer that? One of the specific topic or specific goal of this course is to not only see how you can organize your components, React components, in a way that you can now write performance React applications, as well as how you can memorize components, okay? It's a way to save now rendering, but also to look at how can we now by looking at the React, the concurrency rendering, is that how can we now defer or run or load things later on, okay? And I think this is quite interesting, because this is now provide us this because of the entire problem. This is now how we can is doing or this is now how you can is come up with some of this best practice as a way to solve this kind of issue, and how to actually, when you have this particular use case, what will be a good approach to that. So React rendering. Let's jump straight forward here as a way to make sense of how do we get here, okay? Because it's also something that provide us a lot of context, provide us is a lot of how do we get here. You know, it answered that question. So first we'll look at what React actually does. What is React after all? Which is a JavaScript framework that allows to describe or write user inputs. So first, by looking at how can we describe the UI using JavaScript functions, that return is a JSX, okay, which we also look at how can we import, export components. What is this JSX, which allows us to connect is the handlers to the JavaScript, all right? And how can we now is render conditional components, and as a way to also look at when you want to set different components, how can you, for example, reset the state of these components or preserve the state, something that we're gonna talk about later. But this JSX, they are not new instance. If you come from object-oriented programming, you might think of that. But this is now a blueprint that React returned as a way to understand now how it needs to render these components. And also we look at how can we render list of elements. The important to put a key to tell React, hey, please keep track of this. A good example of this is like when you have files in a folder and you know exactly each one of them. So when you remove someone, it's like, okay, now I have this order. I know what happened here. And something that we also talk about that with the key, especially that key is the way of how can you now store, or how you can is indicate to React to reset the state per order or per component, per data. In other words, we look at how can we render list of elements, as well as how can we now understand the reason of why we create these JavaScript functions in a pure state. Because, well, you want your functions runs in any JavaScript environments, the browser, the server, or the worker, all right? And also, you want your components to prevent to be called. In other words, give you the ability to catch by using memoizing techniques, as well as you want this component to somehow stop the execution when React is rendering all of its components. So how now React see this component is using is a tree structure, which is a computer science data structure that allows us to organize our data. You can think of this data structure pretty much like a place where we can store data or interact with data. For example, a fridge or a backpack. So the idea here is when you say, all right, now if you have some ice cream, you can put that in your backpack. If you have a tablet, you can put that in your fridge, but that's not what they meant to. So this data structure allows us to now solve a specific problem. And in this case, how can we, or how React can see all of these different components. And I think that's quite interesting, all right? Very, 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 very interesting. So this render tree allows to see how React is now passing, how the data flow is going through, as well as how React is now rendering these components for performance, for performance measurement. So as well as we got the tree dependency, so we can now inject or pass or import or utility functions, reusable logic in each one of these components. So the whole point of this is to see how now we can reduce the amount of the size that we send to the client. So we don't want any bloated code here. And that's something interesting. Why is that? Because now when we understand this, the render tree and the tree dependency, now we know how can we describe our components. Simple. But when it comes to adding interactivity, which is after all the whole reason of having now this way of writing components is by looking at how you can connect that through the event handlers. And there, okay, how can we define is states? And the reason to have states in a component as a way to show is data down there. So these components allows us to now set the state, okay, which is update the state, okay. And when you update the state, what happens is that React say, okay, let me now pass through this supply chain. Let me now pass through this mechanism, okay, or the series of phases that I need to actually re-render these components, show you something on the user, on the browser. So this rendering mechanism, anytime you set the state, happens is the trigger. It has a trigger, rendering, and the commit. So the trigger is when, okay, when this state change is happening at the root of the element, or it happening at the component level, or any of its ancestors. So once React detect that, it's time to actually rendering that, which is calling these components, okay. And then when it can be or the initial at the end at the root of elements, when you're going to actually create all of this or rendering all of these React components, or it can be a component state, a component level, which is a component is re-rendering. So React will call that component that caused that state update, and then the return of that, the output, is a JSX, where it's going to evaluate, hey, it's going to store the properties of this state after you evaluate that as a way to use that in the next phase. And then it's going to call all of these React components, and the output of that will continue to evaluate if that contains more React component, and you're gonna do that in a recursive way. So the point of this is that once the React actually traverse or call all of these components in the render tree, all right, now it's time to apply the necessary changes to the DOM, which is the commit phase, and say, all right, I get this. I'm going to apply that to the DOM, as long as there are difference in the React components, as long as they are different between the rendering. And then when the DOM when the browser detects those DOM updates, it's going to paint that. So this process is something interesting to describe, because now when we're going to look at how can we think of state as a way to say, all right, now I know what happened when I set the state, when I update the state, and the state is a memory. You can think of this as that the component is remembering things. Behind the scene is using closure, which is a very beautiful JavaScript concept. I really love it, totally. Anyway, that allows you to now is to store in a persistence, or is that allows to store or to have access to the outer lexical scope, which is great. Once you return is a function. So every time we actually are creating closures. But with React, we have now this ability to make those closures or access to those variables that are outside of the function persistent. So we call this the lexical. We call this persistent lexical state data reference, aka closure. I think that's quite interesting. So making this narrative is something that is powerful. Totally, it is powerful. So yeah, this persistent lexical, persistent lexical scope reference data. And I think I explained that not in a way that is to showing off, to flexing. It's just a way to understand what is the value proposition of the closure. Is that, hey, it allows you to now is persistent. So it allows you to now is that persistent lexical scope reference data. Okay, so it allows now to have this state. It allows to now to store this data persistency as long as the in memory, as long as the user not refresh the page. You know what I mean? It's like, wow, good. Good. So this is the state. How can we set states? Which is passing from this rendering mechanism. And then, okay, how can we think about our states? Okay, especially when we are updating our states. So the TLDR is that think of your state. So think of that when you are setting the state in an event handler, React will fix the state values within the render. Okay, and you're going to see the state value change in the next render. So this is something quite interesting, especially if you're able to describe that, because now lead that to how can we now, for example, perform several updates, state updates, or queuing series of state updates. We look at how can we do that. And for example, when you now cover a specific use case, when you say, hey, I want you to now is reuse is the states across rendering inside of our state event handlers, we can do that by passing this an arrow function. Okay, and this is something interesting when you are dealing with async operations inside of your event handlers. All right. Also, I look at how can we update object in the states, updates array in the state, and the TLDR of that is always return a new state. Okay. Following is also the way of how you need to declare your React components. And this has also come from the solid principle as a way to make our life much more simpler when we're creating scalable, giant, monstrous applications, right? So the solid principle is that single responsibility. Hey, this component must do one thing and one thing well. Open to extension, close to modifications. The least substitution, which is barely know about that, but all that says that the subclass object or the subclass must be able to replace the parent class. Okay, meaning that you somehow must to get is also their properties and methods, followed by their own property and methods, and be able to replace them. So and there also is the interface segregation, which means that instead of having a gigantic object that everybody can have access to this, that's going to now split that for several interfaces, so consumers can now interact. A good example of this is when you look at the browser. In the browser here, it exposes you several interfaces. Okay. So it exposes you the DOM. Let me put it here in English. All right. Like interface. Okay. So it allows you to expose several functionality for that. So hey, you can now is access to the local store, something that we got here. So it actually separates all of this to make it easy to understand them, to make it easy to interact or consume from this API. Hey, we got now all of this specific API that we expose as a way to you can have access or interact with that. For example, resize observer, which is something that exactly. So a good example of this interface is like the event interface. For example, the event target, the element, all right? Just to mention a couple, one of them. So then we also look at the dependency inversion. Is that, hey, do we now in John high level components must not import its low level models. It must rely on an abstractions. So in any case, that was a quick recap of this as a way to now look at the reason of why we actually return is a new state, because managing all of these reference and the mutate that it can cause a ripple effect that, well, make your application harder to extend. And adding is all of this functionality. Because all of this ripple effect. That's why now the functional programming is something that is highly on demand as a way to say, hey, anytime we're going to perform is an action, we would like to now return is a new state. So, which is something that we're going to talk now when you are going to scale your React components by managing them. Okay, so it is important to look at how can we now is set our state, having a state structure. We're gonna see why having a state structure. Look at how to keep the state update logic maintainable, so that doesn't grow like wild grass, wild weed. And also how can we now pass data to different components. Okay, so first is understand how can we, or how React so reacted to input with state. Okay, so React provides a declarative way to manipulate the UI. So instead of manipulate individual pieces of UI directly, you describe the different state that your component can be in, right? This is what it is, and switch between them in response to the user input. So I have now, this is one of the things that is important to actually look at the documentation, because it's telling you this. It's like, instead of actually you having to manipulate each one of those elements, okay, it is much more better for you to actually create is a new state, okay, that your users can switch between them. Okay, so you describe the different state that your component can be and switch between them in response of the user input. That's why we're looking here at reacting to input with state. Now makes a lot of quite sense here. So because as you're going to create your scalable UI, all right, when you say okay, okay, interesting. As your application scale for that, reacting to input with state is a way to say, hey, that's going to now, instead of writing our components in an imperative way, which is pretty much when you get into a taxi cab and you tell the driver, hey, turn left in the next corner, or turn left here, okay, 3 street more and turn right, and then turn left. And so you're going to instruct how you want to go which is, there is nothing wrong with that. But when it comes to actually, in the case of creating all of these components, okay, it can be quite cumbersome to actually work with which one of them, especially if you're going to create now more interactivity to the user. So the analogy here is that instead of you telling exactly how this driver and where the driver must go through, you tell, hey, I want you to now do this, okay? Take me to there. This is the destination. Find the best way to get there. And that's quite interesting. Find the best way to get there. And I think that's quite interesting because now it saves you time. In the case of the taxi cab, it saves you time to actually, you can dedicate to other things, right? Whatever it be. Which is, in our case, is like it. In the case of React, creating the React components, it's like now we can have much more time to dedicate of things that matter most, which is how can we scale this, and how we can make this maintainable. Now, so React say, well, this is now this is the React mental model of describing your UI. First, pretty much like the UI designers, identify your different visual states, then know or determine what trigger those states updates. Okay, if you have a password, for example, and next to that you got a button that shows the visibility of that, what will be is determine what trigger those state updates. Okay, it'll be on chain, it'll be on click. All right, and then you already have is all of these different visual states. All right, and then okay, now it is time to represent those states. Represent those state with use state. Do you know what I mean? So okay, how this component is gonna get rendered, okay, and I want you to represent those state with the use state. Okay, so once you're able to do that, then eliminate or avoid any non-essential states. All right, so you can get your components succinct, and then connect the event handler to set the state properly. So pretty much that's it. This is it. This particularly, this way of describing here is what you're going to do over and 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 over. You get it. You get the idea. So now identify, determine, represent, remove, and connect is a way of how you're going to create any time a feature is that. Is that identify, you can also remember each one of them, okay? Especially when you're going to create your different visual state, okay? So having this, something is like, you're gonna get that. And we'll also put a practice, which is something that I'm going to do tomorrow as a way to build now this Trello clone, okay? So hey, identify the different visual state, determine what trigger those visual states, represent those states with use state. Okay, we can also use reducer, which is another way of how can we make our state updates maintainable. All right, eliminate any non-essential states. All right. Mm-hmm. 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 Eliminate non-essential state updates, okay, and then connect the handler with to set the state. That's it. That's it. That's it. And here we look at anytime we get a selection, UI pattern, use the index or the ID for that. Okay, anytime you have that particular pattern, it's like this. So when developing a component, identify all for its visual state, determine the human and computer trigger for state updates. So determine what caused those state updates. It is a human input, or it is okay. It is a human input, or it is a computer. Okay, it is a human or a computer that trigger that state. Okay, very. I'm going to apply that, bro. I'm going to definitely apply this. Okay, then model the state with your use state and remove non-essential state to avoid bugs and paradox. Eliminate any non-essential states and connect the event handler to set the states. So pretty much is that, you know. And the more you do this, the better you're gonna get this. The more you do this, the better you're gonna get on this. But again, always remember that. And I'm going to put a practice tomorrow. Yeah, totally, man. I'm going. Oh my God, I'm definitely gonna do that. Describing the you are reacting to input state. Oh, okay. Oh my God. Then we look at how can we now managing our state by setting by choosing the state structure. Because now React is giving you some principles as a way to make your state manageable. Okay, this state structure that comes is from the database engineering, where they say that's going to normalize this, eliminate redundancy and duplication. So the principle that React give you when you choose the state update is to say, all right, let's go to now is group related states. Exactly, group related states define. Let's go to now define group related states, eliminate a contradictory state. Okay, which is something that they mention here. So avoid contradiction in the state when the states are structured in a way that several pieces of the state may contradict or disagree with each other. You leave room for mistake. Try to avoid this. It's like avoid any contradictory state. Have clarity when you're writing this. Again, identify all of the different visual states. What trigger those state change is human or computer input. Okay, and by human is a user input. Is users clicking here, or and by computer is I say, hey, do I get this is from an API, for example, or I'm reading it is from the local storage. I am rendering is an image. You know. And then represent those states with the user state. Avoid any non-essential state, which is part of the now organize your state structure here, and then connect the handlers to set the state. So when we're looking here again, recapping this principle to set the state structure, okay, which is again group related state, avoid contradictory state, avoid any redundant state. Ask yourself, can I get this data from one of it is from its props or from another state? Okay, so anytime when React now re-renders its components, I can get is this information that I needed. Okay, and also avoid any duplicated state because it's very hard to keep them sync. Okay. And lastly is avoid deeply nested structures. So you can go with that. It's not recommended because it's not very convenient to update. It becomes quite cumbersome, awkward to update that. And I think that's great. I think that's totally great. Yeah. Oh my god. There it is. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. So we also look at here when you encounter is this UI selection pattern, use the ID or an index for that. So this is something interesting because that data structure, that list must contain an ID. And this ID must come from the database or uh, by generating is the UUID using this npm package for that. So that's great. That's great because now once I look at this, I also look at some of the most common things that you're going to do, especially you're going to work in React, is that uh, share state across components, okay? Or how can you now exactly share states across components? So most of the time you're gonna do something that is lifting state up, all right? Where here, mhm. So where here we're gonna do is this. So if you want to now share a state, if you have several components and you want to grab all of this state and share that. So for example, when you are creating a tab, okay, or a chat app as a way to change between different conversations, okay, you can just lift the state up, all right. Yeah, you can lift the state up and then hard coded the data from the on the parent child, or hard coded the data on the parent component, uh, and then now connect is that each one of these components by passing the hard coded state as well as the handler, all right, and how in each one of these child components you must call those handlers that you're receiving here. And lastly, now set the state at the top. So with this, all right, the idea here is that you can have now a sense of how you can not only live in a state that is shared across multiple components, or it can be one or multiple. So in our case, we look at how can we now share the state. Yeah, share the state is um, by filtering a list, which is a fairly common thing that you're gonna do here. You know, this is something that you're gonna do a lot of the time. You know, it's like, hey, how can I implement this particular feature, filtering lists, and how you can now think of your UI components as small snippet of code for that. So you have now the search bar, and then you have the product list, and then you have now the filterable list, and how by looking at these components, especially how you lift that state, then you, yeah, you leave the state up from the child, the component, you pass down as a props as well as the handler, okay, and voila, you know, uh, and how by looking at this, especially components, uh, by looking at the difference between is the uncontrolled components, yeah, by looking at the difference between uncontrolled and controlled components, it is useful to talk about in terms of how they're gonna work. How do you design your components how do you design your components, and how you do, and what capability this component will have. So, for example, if we talk about now an uncontrolled component, meaning is a component that has an state on that. So it is unflexible. It is also hard to work with other components. Okay, but it allows you to now set this and provide some configurations. So control components, which are much more flexible in that sense, but they don't hold any state of that. So they receive all of its data is from its prop. Again, that's one of the reasons why this is important to look at the terminology and understand why they use that. Okay, uncontrolled components and control components, which is something that they mention here, right? Control and uncontrolled components. In contrast, you may say a component is controlled when the important information it is driven by props rather than in its local state. Okay, and this let the pattern component fully specify its behavior. Exactly, fully specify its behavior. Hey, this is how you're gonna do. This is what you're gonna do. Sorry. This is what you're gonna do. So in practice, control and control are restricted technical terms, but each component usually have some mix of both local state and props. However, this is a useful way to talk about how components are designed and what capability they offer. When writing a component, consider which information it should be controlled via props and which information should be uncontrolled via state. You can always change your mind and refactor later. But that's one of the reasons why it's useful to talk this using those terms, control and uncontrolled component, as a way to see, okay, how components are designed and what are their capability. Mm-hmm. And how by looking at sharing state or by lifting state up, we look at how can we now is yep, we look at now how can we is any piece of state you yeah, for each unique piece of state you will choose which component owns it. Okay, this is known as the source of single source of truth, and by doing that you're now telling to these components how it's going to behave, how all of the other components going to behave on that. And this is something interesting because now that we went through understanding how react or reactive to input state, okay, reacted to input state, the declarative way and the imperative way of doing that, as well as this choose the state structure, right, to make and to prevent any bugs with React, all right, especially to prevent any state bug with React, all right, and also how can we now state or lift state up, okay, or lifting state up as a way to say, hey, now this is the components that is going to be, this is the state that is going to be shared across different child components, okay, and how now we talk about these components in terms of uncontrolled and control components as a way to know how components are designed. Hey, is this component will contain a state, meaning it will have its configuration, its own configurations, all right, aka this is uncontrolled components, or hey, this will be its control component, meaning all of its information will be received as props, okay, It is flexible, but it depends of the pattern components. So now we can get into actually how these components are going to preserve or reset the state. After all, the state is tied to a position on the rendering. Okay, which means that, for example, if we got the same components rendering at the same position in the render, if we got two components rendering at the same position in the render tree, they will preserve their state. If we have different components rendering at the same position, it will reset the state. And how can we now reset the state with the same components, okay, by using or by defining is then in a different or rendering in a different position, okay, or by using is key for that, okay, or resetting a form with key for that, right? If you take a look now at the reference and you say, hey, I want to know the key here, okay, rules of keys, rendering list, where to get your keys, resetting state with key, but this is now not a reference. Create portal. Okay. The resetting state with a key. Okay, you will often encounter the key attribute when rendering list. As okay, it is also certain. So if you have a key on the rendering list of elements, as a way to say exactly. So rendering list here. So with this key listing, keeping list items in order with key. Each child in the list should have a unique key, and you need to give an array and a key here. So key tells React which array items each components correspond, which arrays items, which component corresponds. So it can match them up later. This becomes important if your array items can move due to sorting or getting inserted or get deleted, as well as choose the keys help React infer what exactly happened and make the correct DOM update then. Rather than generating keys on the fly, you should include them in your data. Displaying several DOM nodes for each list item. So what to do when each item needs to render not one but several DOM nodes? The short is fragment. Syntax will let you pass a key, so you need either group them into a single div or use a slightly longer and more explicit fragment syntax. Fragment disappear from the DOM, so this will produce a flat h1 and so on. And this is interesting because here's a situation where you need to write a fragment explicitly instead of using this when you render multiple elements in a loop. You need when you're rendering multiple elements in a group. Okay. You need to assign a key to each element there. Question is that, what if I want to say this? Why not to use a div for that? You can inspect the DOM to verify that there are no wrapper elements around the fragment child. Okay, but as a way to not put this element here, Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. 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 So we look at how can we do that with key, right? Exactly. We look at how can we do that with key here, and how interesting it becomes to do this, right? Because now with key you can tell to React, hey, I want you to keep track is whatever order or whatever value you are putting here. Okay. So by doing this, it's a I'm going to now keep track of the state of this component, all right, and I'm going to render that uh, here. Exactly. I'm gonna reset the state here, because what it's doing is to reset the state here, but based on the order, based on the order. But because we want is to now set the state is on the contact list order. Okay. One way we can do that is to reverse that. But now is to map is the contact.id as a way to say, hey, now I want you to is keep track not the order of this array, okay, but it's the order of the data itself. That's quite interesting. And also we look at how can we now uh, uh, extracting the state into a reducer as a way to now when you're going to handle a lot of this yeah when you're about to handle a lot of state updates, okay, so you want to be that in the most testable and debuggable way possible, okay. So with reducers, which is something new in React, okay, and I really love about this, okay, which is also before this we had this now something called this Redux as a way to do that, all right, to make the state management debuggable, all right. It's also I think this is an inspiration from that to actually integrate that concept here. Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm. Because it's pretty much like this. It's heavily influenced uh, by that. You know, this is actually pretty much this. So legacy handwriting Redux. The subtle difference here is that Redux is to make our state management is to make our app level or top level app or top level state management debuggable and testable, right? Because it provides you now this thing called time travel debug, so you can see how this state is updating through time. And one of the beautiful things, especially when you now, for example, identify is how your users are crashing your app, is by, which is something that I see in some developers, is now they dump the Redux history through any of these error servers. They receive that dump, and now they load that into their app as a way to see how, as a way to now look at how the user is, uh, look at the journey of your user crashing your app. That's quite convenient. That's quite convenient. Totally, totally. So Reducer and Redux actually is now more focus is on this local state, right? Hey, are you handling is several uh, are you handling is or are you need to handle is several user interface or several user interactions, okay? Are you and you're handling several user interactions at this level? All right, use Reducer might be the way to go to that. So a good example of that is a chat app. Okay, hey, are you actually now is handling is most of this? So let's going to keep call. Let's going to read this. Okay, so components with many state updates spreads across many event handlers. Completely. So components with many state updates spread across several event handlers and can get overwhelming because you're going to have all of these different handlers for that. And then you say, okay, we need to find some way to make this maintainable, to make all of these state updates maintainable. So for this case, you can consolidate all of the state update logic outside your component in a single function called Reducer, which is just a fancy name to say Reducer is just a function that takes a state in an action to generate is a new bit of state from that. So based on these actions, I'm going to generate is a new bit of state for that. And that's quite interesting. Yeah. This particular approach, it not only is allowing us to think in terms of how can we make all of these state updates logic maintainable by also using is some of the concept from React. Okay, all of these software engineers that are working behind the scenes, so all of the people behind React, and holy moly, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, especially when you have a because your handles is going to be used to set the state. The more handles you have, or the more user interaction that this component needs to deal with, okay, the much more sense you'll have to say, all right, it is time to use a Reducer. Question: when will you use a Reducer? In my particular case, you know, in my particular case, if I have to deal, if I got more than 3 event handlers, if I got 3 event handlers or more, now this is a good candidate. This is a component that is a good candidate to say, hey, do we really need this? And if it is, can we now abstract them into a Reducer function using the Reducer? Okay. A good example of this, it can be in this, if a component, okay, if a uncontrolled component, for some reason, okay, all right, if an uncontrolled component, for some reason, all right, yeah, if an uncontrolled component for some reason holds some data, okay, so this is the data, and if we're going to now select among this data as a way to show this content, now it makes a good candidate to say, all right, what's going to actually handle this. So I would really like to see that in action when you are creating is this drag and drop API. tomorrow. But all what I'm doing here is just to see how now can we actually is make sense of all of this. Okay. And well, what are the things when you have a component that uses states, how you can now migrate to the use reducer. So first is move the setting state to dispatching actions, which is that, well, what are all of the event handlers here, and move them to the event handlers. Okay. Remove all of the state logic, all of the state setting logic here, and instead you're gonna replace that with the dispatch this. So once you do that, you're going to return as an object with the things that you want to, with the state, with the new state updates. So the object you pass to dispatch is called an action. So on your reducer function, which you holds that, all right, it takes in the state and an actions, and this is another thing that you're going to perform to this particular state. So Redux. Okay. So for example, reducer is that kind of thing. Specific to component, all the fields go here. And then you write a reducer function which will contain all of the state or all of the setting state to tell now React to do what to do. When you're going to set that, return next state for React to set, which is in our case. And instead of using it as an if, we use it as a switch for that. Again, all of these are good practice, part of the way of how you can do this. Why are reducer called this way? This is from the reduce function, like that, on the array, where now it takes, it allows you to accumulate a single value out of many, which is in this case is this. So it allows you to accumulate all of this value into exactly. It allows you to you take an array and accumulate a single value out of many. Use the reducer from your component here, right? When you say, okay, import use reducer, and this is exactly, you initially pass is the reducer function, okay? So all of this is state updates logic, and then the initial state. That's very, very interesting. So, not only that, but also comparing the use state and use reducer. Code size, generally with use state you have to write less code up front, no problem. But with use reducer you have to write both a reducer function and dispatch action. However, use reducer can help you cut down on the code if many event handlers modify state in a similar way. Many event handlers modify state in a similar way. Readability. Use state. It is very easy to read the state of simple. So when they get more complex, you can block your components code and make it difficult to scan with use state, because now you have a particular state that connect to several of these user interactions, aka all of these handlers here. So use reducers are much more easy to test. Okay, a reducer is a pure function that doesn't depend on your component. This means you can export and test it separately in isolation. While generally is the best test. Generally it is best to test component In a more realistic environment, for complex update logic, it can be useful to assert that your reducer returns a particular state for a particular initial state and action, and personal preference. So the whole point of this is that reducer must be pure, and each action describes a single user interaction, even if that leads to multiple changes in data. Each action describes a single user interaction, even if that leads to multiple changes in data. For example, if a user presses reset on a form with 5 fields managed by a reducer, it makes more sense to dispatch one reset form action rather than 5 separate set field actions. If you log every action in a reducer, the log should be clear for you to reconstruct what action or response happened in what order. So this helps debugging. And then the using now is Immer for that. Oh, it's because using is Immer for that. Use Immer reducer. But again, you receive an state, but now this is to give you a much more like mutable syntax. Okay. To give you a much more mutable syntax for that. Okay. So far so good, right? Because now I look at this extracting state logic with a reducer. Okay. So dispatch action from event handlers for that. So instead of actually having all of this state, we're going now is to call is the dispatch. Okay. And it's here in our dispatch when we dispatch this based on the contact list here. When we dispatch this based on the contact list here, and you say, hey, I want you to now trigger this dispatch. So now this is useful when you know to describe this component. This is a control component. All of it is a state will count as props. Good. Which means that here we're going to define is the dispatch. Okay. And here, when now we are rendering is this element, I want you to now dispatch with the type of the action, okay, which is only one. Each action describes a single user interaction. In this case is on the message here. We want is to change selection here. So, hey, I want you to now trigger the change selection. What is the data that this dispatch needs to? Is the action the contact ID? Okay. As a way to say, hey, the change selection, the select ID, which come from the action. That's right. No, it's contact ID. Exactly, it's contact ID because that's the action that we are dispatching to that, and that'll be is the contact.id. So now this is able to dispatch this action, okay, and change the proper message. So select that to show is now that component here, okay, you tell React, hey, I want you to now keep a state here, and you reset that. you're going to reset that for that. So this is the way how you tell React, hey, keep track of this component chat and reset its state. So when we need to call them. I also look at something interesting here, like restoring input value when switching between tabs. Because here, now that we got is the initial state here. So in this example, switching between different recipients always clears the hex input. Okay, switching between always clears the same input, so we don't have any idea to actually map to which state this belongs. You know, mapping. We don't have idea to which state this belongs, and as a way to do that, well, yep. Yep, and as a way to do that, all right. Yep. And as a way to do that, okay, to remember, because if one wants to now remember things here, we would like to know this state, as a way to remember here, we would like to know if somehow this message here contains something, you know? You say, hey, 0 will be is hello, Tyler? Is hello Taylor. Okay, hello Taylor, right? So when we now, which is something that we're going to show initially here, by saying, hey, now the initial state here is, well, is 0, that. Okay, at that position is 0. And we have now the selected index here. As a way to keep track of this. So maps allows to mapping things here. So with that, now that we're actually showing is the proper data, we need to know when this element dispatched, okay? And look at here as the particular pattern. Look at the particular pattern that we're using here. Is that because this is the initial state, okay? And we want to now keep track all of this chats here. I want you to now, anytime we change that, okay, anytime we change this, okay, anytime we change this, we not only update the state with the proper data. You know what I mean? By saying something like this. So on change selection here, on change selection, I want you to now is show the proper message here, which is, for example, if I click here, no problem with that. But on change selections, I want now to show is the message, okay, whose index is the action.contact ID, okay, which is the selected, okay, or we can say is the selected, the state dot selected ID, okay, followed by the message that we're receiving here, okay, or followed by the state dot message, because now you are is exactly, look at this. So this is a user this is a user this is a user interface. This is a user, Jesus, this is a user interaction, okay. So what we're doing here is to actually reset that, okay, reset it, reset it, reset it, reset it. But I don't want to reset that. Instead, I just want us to now show what we got here. You know what I mean? State.message, okay, because I'm returning is a new state of the state that, but the state.message, I want you to now spread all of this state message, and when we select that, when we change the selection, I want you to now add the selected ID, okay, which means is that adding this, adding the action.contact ID, something that we receive from that, okay, which is now the selected ID, followed by the message at that position. You know what I mean? Follow at the message at that position. So we are now returning as a new state. It means that if the it means that the ID that we're receiving here. But it's interesting because this is when we change selection. This is when we change selection. We will now is to show, okay. I'm going to return as a new state here, but I want is to, what I want? Is to show the proper message there, if you got anything. So how can you do this? Action.contact ID. As a way to say, well, because I now have the selected ID, the state of selected ID, okay. I want now to pick this one. No. Really? Because at the end of the day, what I want to show is this message 0, but this is not message 0. Instead, this is the state dot selected ID. It's quite different. You know, this is exactly we're showing is on the selected ID. Okay, so what is the selected ID? Is that, all right, I want you to now show all of the message here, but that selected ID no, this is it, okay. So I want you to now show all of the state message ID. So initially you're gonna show is the this is message, okay. Very exactly, it's now message, like so. So here we are now in theory. Show is this. Okay, show all of the message, and with that change, which you trigger is a render, now you have all of the selected message as it is, followed by that's quite interesting, because here you are not choosing is that state.selected. Oh my god, selected ID. Exactly. So when you change this, I just want us to now change the same selection. No more. This is the state that I want to change. And when you edit the message, instead of actually doing this, you're going to say it's like, all right, I want you to now is inside of this particular object, because I keep track of this selected selected ID, okay, of this selected ID. This is what you're going to pass here. Okay, you say, hey, hello, Tyler. Okay, selected ID is okay because it's state dot selected ID. Question: are we receiving is this from this state? Are we receiving is now the ID when you edit the message here? When you edit the message, we can say is, hey, we're gonna get this ID from the contact dot ID. And then here on the edit message we say action ID now we're going to use as a state selection. We're going to use this followed by the message that we're receiving from that. As well as the state dot, because we're generating is a new state from that. Okay. Oh no, just like this. So hello Tyler. We can also is for some reason when we edit the message here, edit message here is actually triggering is this message. Jesus is not actually updated that properly, and then you got it. So we change that. Of course, there is our error runtime. Contact is undefined, which means that when we change that, okay, the selected ID is action.contact.id. Okay, which now is what we are passing through that. And then he say when he passes this is the contact.id. So when it changed by triggering is this, but oh, but we are not sending is exactly. We're not sending is all right. Makes sense. You're gonna put it. You're gonna now send this the ID. Okay, and we're not sending is the ID here. And now we're sending is the ID here, which is the contact dot ID, right? And here you're actually receiving it when you change that, and we're able to preserve that. We can mutate that, and we're able to preserve that. That's quite interesting, bro. Holy moly. Holy F. Because now with this state, we can have now. It makes more sense. It makes more sense to actually do this. It makes a lot of sense to actually do this. It makes a lot of sense to actually do this. Because it's your state that you are updating, and because you're creating a new state out of this, you need to is on those handlers pass the proper data in dispatch the proper data in those actions. And on the initial state, you are going now to say, all right, this is now the structure of this. So we're going to keep track of all of this as it is. And the way now how that those database must keep track of this is by using is this is backend job. This is backend job. Okay. You identify each one of them with this. Exactly. On the edit message, exactly, you're going to show them. On the edit message, you're gonna show them, okay, and then assign the proper data that you're getting as an input to this, right? And also you will have to modify is your state here as a way of how you're going to select that, and that's all. And not only that, but you need to, because here you edit that message, okay, and when you change that, you're going to pass is the proper ID to that. And I think they actually is sending this as it is. Mhm. Mhm. Notably, you didn't need to change any event handler. That's one of the beautiful thing of this. I didn't have to change any event handlers. In fact, what I need to know is the state shape and which data I'm going to receive as a way to update this. You are now working with this with data. With a reducer, you will have to change every event handler that update this state. In the next chapter here is like implement a user reducer from scratch. In the early example, you import the user reducer from hook from React. This time you will implement the user reducer hooks itself. Hook itself. Here's a step to get you started. So because now this function will take is the reducer function, okay? And after all, we're going to dispatch here where now this dispatch will contain is the last state of our reducer, which is the reducer. This is the function of a reducer must take the initial state. Okay, and this reducer where we are passing is the proper data here. Our reducer must trigger that. Our reducer must trigger this. Okay, our reducer must trigger this messenger reducer. Because here is where we are getting is our reducer, this function that it will take. Okay, this function that it will take is this reducer function that will take the state and the action, and okay, it'll take the state and the action. But wait a single moment. We're going to return is now this new state for this. Okay, it returns a new state for that. exactly, because this patch is actually like triggering is this. And this reducer, what it's doing is to returning you a new object where you're going to set that state. You know what I mean? Return a new object from the reducer to set that state. So this reducer that we're receiving, we will get is a new object, okay, when that happened. So initially here, when this happened, the use reducer, it say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and also is going to take a look at the message state here that it must have here on the state where you already have that. Okay, so far so good. Okay, and next I'm going to now is to select that ID. Okay, on the contact. So I'm going to now render this component, the contact list. Okay, and the contact list actually is dispatching that. The contact list is now dispatching that particular action. Okay, so here this dispatch spec. This dispatch expect to be a function. This dispatch expect to be a function. Okay, where we're going to take the action. Oh my god, that makes a lot of sense. Where we're gonna take the action as an object. Okay. Yeah, where we're going to take the action as an object, and then we're going to set the state for that. God damn it, bro. And then we're gonna set that because this patch after all is a function that we're sending these objects called actions that contain is the type to indicate the user interaction where you can modify the data as you want it, and that will trigger is a set state, and that will trigger is a state updates. But that state update will be is based on the reducer function or this new state that you are generating based on the previous states and the action. God damn it. Holy moly. What in the F, bro? And then you set the state from there. But I'm doing is this because now the output of this, because what is going on is say, hey, this dispatch label is going to be assigned to a function, an arrow function, where now you're going to is receive is an action, okay, and call the set state with this parameter, and this parameter is this reducer function. This reducer function that takes an state and an actions and generate a new state out of this state that is being used by the set state to tell React, hey, I want you to now trigger this rendering with this new state. Okay? And pass from the render and commit phase until we're able to see what's going on here. And actually this will work as expected. So anytime we now trigger it or we dispatch is an action, we're going to actually set we're going to set the state properly for that. God damn it, bro. This is because the dispatch actions are queued until the next render. Similar to the updater function. Okay, though it doesn't matter in most cases, a slightly more accurate implementation look like this. Because after all, now when you are able to do this, okay, if you want to actually batch several state updates, you say is now this. Hey, which is the state, as a way to batch is a series of state updates. Damn, son. All right, next one. Passing data deeply with context. Usually, you will pass information from a parent component to a child component via props. But passing props can become verbose and inconvenient, of course, if you have to pass them through many components in the middle, or if maybe components in your app need the same information. Context like the parent component makes some information available to any component in the tree below it, no matter how deep, without passing it explicitly through props. Exactly. So context lets the parent component make some information available to any components in the tree. So no matter how deep, without passing it explicitly through props. But again, context is something that it'll introduce this indeterministic behavior, because it will render our components when the parent state, it will render our context, it will trigger a render when the context change. It will trigger a render when the components of React change. It will trigger a rendering. It's because it will trigger a rendering. It will trigger a rendering here. It will trigger a rendering here. So the problem with passing props. Passing props is a great way to explicitly pipe data through the UI3 to the component that uses it. But passing props can become verbose and inconvenient when you need to pass some props deeply through the tree. Often many components need the same props. The nearest ancestor could be far removed from the components that needed data, and lift state up that can highly lead to a situation called props drilling. Exactly, lifting state ups, and then you have the props drilling there. So wouldn't it be great there is a way to teleport data to the component in the tree that it needs without passing props? With React context feature, that is. Context is an alternative to passing props. Like so. You have the setting, you have this, okay? You have all of this. So let's say you want multiple heading within the same section to always have the same size. Okay. So currently you pass the level props to each heading separately. This is a way to pass this hard-coded data. It would be nice if you could pass the level props to the section components instead and removing it from the heading. This way you could enforce that all headings in the same section have the same size. Section level 3, heading about photos and videos, right? But how can the heading components know the level of its closest section? That will require some way to for a child to ask for data from somewhere above in the tree. You can do you can do it with props alone. If there This is where context comes into play. That will require some way to for a child to ask for data from someone above in the tree. You can do this with props alone. This is where context comes into play. You will do it in 3 steps. Create a context. You can call it level context since it is for the heading level. Use a context from the component that needs the data. Heading will use level context. And provide the context from the component that specifies the data. Section will provide level context. But you can do this with props alone. This is where context comes into play when you need to pass down data to distinct component. So you will do it in 3 steps. Create a context. This is the know-how. This is the know-how. Create a context. You can call it level context since it is for the heading level. Use that context from the component that needs the data. Okay. Create the context. You can call it level context since it is the heading level. Use that context from the component that needs the data. Heading will use level context, and then provide that context from the component, and then provide the, oh my god, I get it. And then provide that context from the component that specifies the data. Section will provide level content. So, step 1, create a context. We create a context, like so. That's quite interesting. And then the heading, First you will need to create a context, and you will need to export it from a file so that your components can use it. Level context. The only argument to create context is the default value. Here's one. Refers to the biggest heading level, but you could pass any kind of value, even an object. You will see the significance of the default value in the next step. Import the use context from hook. So you're telling now React, hey, I want you to now make use of this. Alright, make use of this way to persist our data here, and instead remove the level props and read the value from the context in there. Use context is a hook. Just like use state and use reducer, you can only call a hook immediately inside of a React component. You can only call a hook immediately inside of a React component. This JSX function, not inside loops or condition. Use context tells you can only call a hooks immediately inside of a React component, like that. Use context tells React that the heading component wants to read the level context. Hey React, I want you to now read this context. Now that the heading component doesn't have a level prop, you don't need to pass the level props to the heading in the JSX like this anymore. Update the JSX so that is the section that receives it instead. As a reminder, this is the markup that you were trying to get to working. It's on the section level as it is. However, because we defined then there, okay, so on the heading you're going to make use of that context. Again, it's introducing now this indeterministic behavior. Notice this example doesn't quite work. It's a subheading. title, heading, subheading, subheading, subheading. It's actually not working quite well. Notice this example doesn't quite work yet. All the headings have the same size because even though you are using the context, you are not providing it yet. React doesn't know where to get it. React doesn't know where to get it. But you tell React that you notify React to read this data. If you don't provide the context, React will use the default value you have specified in the previous step. In this example, you specify 1 as the argument to create context. So use context level, context returns 1. So it's putting I want to read this data whose value is 1. Let's fix the problem by having each section provide its own context. The section component currently rendering it as children. Okay. And then now they can provide is that. This tells React if any component inside of the section asks for the level, if any component inside of the section asks for the level context, give them this level, the component you will use the value of the nearest level context provider in the UI 3 above it. It is the same result as the original code, but you did not need to pass the level props to each heading component. Instead, it's figuring out it is heading level by asking the closest sections above. You pass a level props to the section. Section rabbit is children with the level context that provide the value, and heading asks the closest value of the and heading asks the closest value of the level context above with use context level. Oh nigga, this introduces I get it why this introduces indeterministic behavior, bro. This example use headings level because they show visually how nested component can override context. But context is more useful for many other use cases too. You can pass down any information needed by the entire subtree, the current color theme, the currently logging user, and so on. Context path through intermediate component. You say on this section, I want you to read this data. I want you to read this data. I want you to read this data and provide that content. And as the closest value of the level context above the use that. And then provide that so closest components that wants to use that, and closest component of the data provided, they can read that. Oh nigga, this introduces undeterministic behavior. Buenos Aires in the rhythm of tango. I love it. Context lets you write components that adapt to their surroundings. and displaying themselves differently depend on where, or in other words, in which context they are being rendered. How context work might remind that your CSS property inheritance. In CSS, you can specify color blue for div for any DOM node inside of it. No matter how deep, will inherit that color unless some DOM node in the middle override it is color green. Similarly, in React, the only way to override some context coming from above it is wrap children into a context provider with a different value. In CSS, different properties like color and background don't override each other. You can set all the different color to red without impacting the background color. Similarly, React contexts don't override each other. Before you use context, context is very tempting to use. However, this also means it is easy to overuse it. Just because you need to pass some props several levels deep down doesn't mean you put the information into a context. Here's a few alternatives you should consider before using context. Start by passing props. If your components are not trivial, it is not unusual to pass down props down through the dozen components. It may feel like a slog, but it makes it very clear with component use with data. Extract components and pass GSX as children to them. Start by passing props. Extract component and pass GSX as children to them. Use cases for context. Theming, current account, routing. To manage complex state and path. Oh shit! React will update all the components reading it below. This is why context is often used in combination with state. In general, if some information is needed by distinct component in different part of the tree, it is a good indicator that context will help you. But again, context is not limited to static value. If you pass a different value on the next render, React will update all the components reading it below. This is why context is often used in combination with state. Exactly. Context is not limited to static value. If you pass a different value on the next render, React will update all the components reading it below. This is why context is often used in combination with state. Replacing prop drilling with context. And scaling up with reducer and context. Combining a reducer with context, create context, put a state and dispatch, use context anywhere in the tree, and move it all wiring into a single file. Okay, this is something that you're going to dedicate time, but yeah, that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.